Awesome.
Excellent. Happy Friday, everyone.
Well, we are so close to being completely done with the General Assembly 2026 session. I'll go into a little bit more details shortly of what still needs to happen, but for right now, we got a pretty good snapshot of what's made it through, what hasn't, and what we can expect for next week. I think we've got a critical nexus of people coming in. I'm going to go ahead and get started with my presentation. I'm going to like fly through it. If you've got questions, feel free to put them in the chat and I'll go back to them afterwards and answer. But here we are. It is April 17th, not April 7th. And we're going to talk about what has happened since the governor had to make a decision on April 13th on all of the legislation. So, kind of orienting people if this is your first time thinking or understanding Virginia General Assembly and the legislature in Virginia, we are at the very end. Um, the session adjourned. The governor had a couple days to make decisions on all the bills that passed, and the governor could either approve it, amend it, or veto it. And with vetoes, she had to have an explanation. Those vetoes and amendments go back to the General Assembly, and then they will meet next week to reconvene and figure out if they want to accept the governor's amendments, reject them, or override the veto. And the override for the veto needs 2/3 majority. So we will see how that plays out on April 22nd. If you've also been following the General Assembly, you will know that we don't have a budget bill. And so a special session has been called on April 23rd, the day after the reconvene session, to talk about that budget bill. But this is the orientation of what's happening and where we are, and keep moving forward. So I like keeping track of my own stats and like what I was looking at to like help figure out, what is the change over each session. In 2025, there were 3,107 total legislative items, and I call items because they include bills, resolutions, and joint resolutions. But those bills, nearly 2,400, there are 2,366. I was tracking mostly everything in the Agriculture, Chesapeake, and Natural Resources Committee. And so when you look at knowing that there's nearly 2,400 bills, I was tracking about 6% of the bills. Of the bills that passed, there was a 49% pass rate this session, and that was up from 26% from last session in 2025. Now, I, of course, love to advocate for the Virginia Public Access Authority. If you are unfamiliar, they also have a bill tracker, and I just want to go to it because it's also very beautiful. For their nearly 2,400, just to see different data, since I'm only tracking a little bit and they're tracking everything, 1,208 passed. They track what margin of passing did happen, which I think is awesome. So 376 were unanimous, 396 just went through party lines, and then 436 passed with opposition where they weren't on party lines. Where bills died, really cool. House committee, subcommittee, which would make the most sense. They were never actually heard at the committee, and then they weren't heard on the floor. And we can then break down things based on political party. I thought the most interesting statistic was we had a record low bills killed with no recorded vote. So sometimes what will happen is a bill will never be heard. And specifically last year, there was a high one that I remember, and I was surprised to see that we have a record low in terms of the last 10 years, that most places actually got a record amount. We also have higher partisan voting. So more than 40% opposition is the highest that they've been tracking in the last 10 years. And it's pretty average with, I think, 49% of bills being passed in this session, a little bit better than the 39% passed last year. But if you haven't checked it out, kind of the visuals on the Virginia Public Access project are really, really cool to look through. Let me go back. All right, so for a little wetlands watch and our way of tracking things, we tracked about 67 bills. 35 of those died, 32 of those did survive. Most of them came from the House. Most of them were bills, but we were tracking some budget items and some resolutions. And Delegate Krizik was the delegate with the most bills that we were tracking. Just some little statistical descriptive statistics for everyone. Looking at it a different way, because just because we're tracking bills doesn't mean that Wetlands Watch necessarily has it as a high priority. Sometimes we're just tracking them just for pure interest and just keeping, our finger on the pulse. And some of them were like high priority. So when we look at, first thing is like when we're looking at all of these bills, can we categorize and collate them into policy areas? And fortunately, we could. And so with those policy areas, were there any trends? Most of the wetlands, environmental justice, and governance, and especially invasive species management had a really good year with all 100% pass rates. The big one that you're going to see that pulls out is this coastal resiliency part. Only 2 of the 12 that I collated as being underneath coastal resiliency, which could range from, the CSRM fund, the Coastal Storm Risk Management Fund, to help figure out how the state wants to afford these really big, for example, the Norfolk seawall. How are we going to go and pay for that? That bill, of course, died. And one of the things that everyone should know about this General Assembly is affordability is the name of the game. So if there were fiscal impact statements attached to bills, they pretty much were sent to appropriations and then were gently laid on the table. So while it does look like coastal resiliency did not have a good year, a lot of them did have fiscal impacts. So it was sort of expected. When we look at priority, we had a lot of high priority bills in coastal resiliency, which is why I pull it out, that we were, we'll see if it goes, but we sort of recognized that there were going to be affordability, name of the game. If it had money, it wasn't going to go. Other things, climate resiliency, the difference between climate resiliency, coastal resiliency, and disaster resiliency, or just coastal resiliency had something to do with the coastal zone. Climate resiliency was something that had to do with climate statewide and was not specific to coastal. And then disaster resiliency, specifically targeting emergency preparedness for disaster. But we're going to go into more details for these bills, just looking at the screenshot beginning. So let's talk about vetoes, since we do know that there were only 8 vetoes this year. And actually, I'm going to go back here, look at another visual because they have Spanberger's first term vetoes. She had 8 her first term when we compare it to the previous administration, 33. So impressive, a decrease. So if we look at all years, of course, we will see what happens first, second, third year for Governor Spanberger, but she's pretty on the low side in terms of vetoing. She mostly moved things forward. But the one bill that we were tracking that has anything to do with sort of environmental and water issues was HB 86. It was the mattress stewardship program. In her memo explaining why she vetoed it, it was going to raise costs. Essentially, this recycling program, mattress companies would have to buy in and pay costs, and she was afraid that was going to be shared. Those costs would be shared with purchasers. So she vetoed that. Yeah, that's all I have to say about that. Wasn't tracking it too carefully. It was something just that we were just aware of that was happening. And then when I saw it pop up, I was like, gotta call out to that. For amendments, there were 3 amendments on bills that we were tracking. And so the First Amendment was to Senate Bill 197, which had to do with the CFPF interest deferral. This, if you're unfamiliar, the Community Flood Preparedness Fund is the main fund to fund flood resiliency projects and studies and planning capacity building in Virginia. There's a grant program, grants being free money, and there's also a loan program. And the loan program has 2.2% interest for non-low income geographic areas, and I think it's 1.2% for low income geographic areas. If you want to take a loan out, you have to pay that money back, of course. One of the proposals from Senator Williams Graves was to defer that interest until the project or study is completed. The only change is that this is completed or canceled. So just a technical change, probably from the Virginia Resources Authority, making sure that if a community takes a loan out in the CFPF and then it ends up not going through for whatever reason, it's not stuck in a loophole of like needing to be completed in order to be paid back. And why we care, federal funding specifically through FEMA would only start interest when the project was completed. So if you're having trouble, finding contractors or going through environmental impact statement, other sort of administrative parts in which the project is making its way through, interest isn't necessarily occurring during that time, that there's nothing changing on the ground. And so now that this is giving more breathing room for localities. The Second Amendment that we saw was a Senate Bill 225. This is the Virginia Clean Energy Innovation Bank. The most interesting part was it actually creates a fund. In the original bill, it was just essentially a board composition and like a purpose. It's actually has a fund with 3 sub buckets, and then it restructures the board composition from 10 to 8, with 6 of the board members being chosen by the legislature and then 2 being gubernatorial appointees. And why we care is like the Clean Energy Innovation Bank is helping fund projects that sort of spurline the clean energy revolution that would then help mitigate greenhouse emissions in the future, which is that mitigation part of the mitigation and adaptation balance, trying to work around and adapt to climate change. Then the last amendment that fell in the legislation that I was tracking was House Bill 1037. This was a climate literacy bill to include instructional material standards for local school boards. Why we care is, of course, we want students to understand why climate change is important for wetlands as well as for coastal resiliency. And the big change around this was it's no longer going to be a part of a standing code provision. It's just going to be a one-time directive, and then it pushes these changes back to the next standard of learning SOL revision cycle, which for me is a little disappointing to hear. I'll be honest, educational policy is not my forte. I'm aware that there were science SOLs happening in December of 2025, and that was it was an update from the 2018 SOLs. It is unclear to me if this new 2025 edition means that that cycle is over, or if this change to the revision cycle is still within, like if it's going to finish in actually 2026, or if this will be for the 2031, 2032 revision cycle. If anyone has any background on that, please let me know. Would love to learn more about how those educational SOLs work. But moving on, so some of the rest are things that have happened that I'm just going to cover pretty quickly. The bill that I worked on a lot during the assembly that did not make it, was continued, was our state precipitation standards bill. HB 1356. If you're unfamiliar, this is the first time you're hearing about it. We use something called Atlas 14 Volume 2 precipitation standards. What these are, they're just mathematical probabilities of specific storm events to help build infrastructure, culverts, roads, etc. And that Atlas 14 Volume 2 was based on like the 1800s to 2000. So we haven't updated these standards in a while. And with intense and more frequent precipitation, it seems intuitive that we would want to start capturing these new changes as we build infrastructure in the future. And so one of the goals was to help streamline the adoption of this new precipitation standards, both with a update that we're really hoping, which is down here. It's Atlas 14 Volume 13, which Virginia is part of this update. Word on the street is that it's going to be end of Q3 in 2026. I'm not going to hold my breath, but I am hopeful. The other thing is that there's something called Atlas 15 Volume 1 and Volume 2. And that Atlas 15 are updated values that aren't necessarily based on the geographic boundary of a state, but they're continuous across the entire United States. And then the cool part is this Volume 2 that is thinking about precipitation in the future based off of the information that we know now. Can we like forecast where we think rain events should be so that we can help build, for example, culverts that can handle bigger storm sizes. Today's 100-year event, maybe tomorrow's 50-year event when it comes down, because we're seeing much more frequent and much more intense rainstorms that they happen. Did not make it. Part of it had to do with where, what like code section it was in. Another part had to do, so if you're unfamiliar, if you want to work with a delegate to make legislative changes, you will provide either a concept or even bill language to a delegate, and they will then provide it to the Division of Legislative Services, DLS. And so like a group of lawyers that help streamline and make sure that all the bill text is compliant to the Code of Virginia. And one of the lines in when we reread it and how it was framed didn't seem like it could be workable because it had to do with sometimes when state agencies are making decisions, they can fast track changes if it doesn't actually have a significant impact. For example, if you're like changing a fee structure or doing internal structuring, they don't need to necessarily go through the entire APA process, administrative process of announcing what's going to happen. And then one of these subsections is if there's no discretion is needed. But when you're thinking about forward thinking precipitation values, there will be a lot of discretion, and you would need to figure out which curve do you want to use when we're planning the future. We want to go extremely high, in the middle, or low. Those would need to be figured out. And so without having consensus, we ended up wanting to continue and have all different state agencies, VDOT, DEQ, DCR come together and talk through a better and more like comprehensive and robust for moving forward to figure out what we want our future-oriented state precipitation standards to be. So there was continued to 2027 with a letter to the both the Joint Subcommittee on Recurrent Flooding, but as well as the Natural Resources Committee. The other bill that we followed closely was HB 214. This was going to establish a home flood protection assistance program. It was struck from the docket by the patron, Delegate Fagans from Virginia Beach. It was going to help. So in Virginia Beach, I think it's the context of both the delegate and where he was coming from is important. Virginia Beach has a really cool stormwater assistance program where members of the city go out and look at stormwater and flood issues on private property and help suggest, provide education. But that education isn't connected with financing. And so we have something called the Resilient Virginia Revolving Fund that Delegate Fagans also has provided another bill. And so he was aware of that. And I think this is my interpretation. He wanted to connect that RVRF with something that a locality could then help tap into that finances and then start doing flood protection assistance on the ground without necessarily looking at previous legislation. I think back in 2023, there was another bill that for stormwater funding allowed localities to create a flood mitigation program that would help assist up to $5,000 on private property and condominiums that Northern Virginia localities have already implemented, like in I think Arlington, Fairfax. And so with this new program, it lowered the threshold from $5,000 to $3,000 and also put in a whole bunch of checks that the local government would need to do with like a site visit. And if you have, thousands of people having flood issues, that's thousands of visits a year. And it didn't seem workable. I also requested a third party administrator try to speed that up, but I don't know of anyone who would want to volunteer for that because that's a lot of checking and paperwork. And so that was struck from the docket. Other things that have passed and are moving forward, we do, or we will at least, have state policy around the beneficial use of dredge material. Dredge material is the material that is taken out of the bottoms of channels and navigationable channels. Our policy, unfortunately, in Virginia has been to dump that offshore in the ocean, whereas other states like Maryland reuse that material in other ways. And sometimes there is new science to say that we can actually potentially use dredge material to help elevate marshes that are drowning due to sea level rise. And so you would take some of that material, hopefully it's clean and the right thickness, and then you would be able to spray that on a drowning marsh that would then help the marsh accrete and then grow stronger back in the future. And since we don't have a policy right now and it's unclear if you can permit, there are a lot of pilot projects happening, even here in Norfolk with the Elizabeth River Project, as well as the Middle Peninsula and the Eastern Shore. So we're on the precipice. What this bill also includes is a work group to think this through, and the enactment clause is in December of 2027. So there's some time to think through how we want to have a state policy around the beneficial use of dredge material. HB 237 passes was a bill not to conserve Virginia. I need to update that, but for the Coastal Resiliency Master Plan. So with sea level rise, wetlands are in a tough, between a hard place and a bulkhead if they are in like a urban or suburban area. And if that water keeps rising, those wetlands can't migrate anywhere because they're coming to some sort of thing that stops them. Are there places that we need to be looking around Virginia that may be beneficial for migration so that they can keep going? We can still have the multiple beneficial values and functions of a wetland without losing them and potentially having just a whole bunch of mudflats in some parts of the Chesapeake Bay. And so this was just a simple addition to the Coastal Resiliency Master Plan to think about wetland migration zones in the future. Wetlands Watch just came back from a wetlands workshop at William and Mary that was held earlier this week, thinking through what do we need in order to start thinking about planning. When we think about wetlands policy in the state, a lot is happening. We have the Wetlands Policy Task Force. We have a Wetlands Technical Policy team or team through the Division or Department of Wildlife Resources. A lot of people are talking about wetlands and what we have to do it. We're also, it feels like, on the precipice of like figuring out what we need to do and then hopefully start doing it. So this is exciting that we will at least have a layer that everyone can I'll look at. Apparently, there are 10 different models. The wetlands workshop was interesting, and I learned a lot about the data that we already have that could help inform where wetlands will migrate in the future. We have no net loss in VMRC, so the Virginia Marine Resource Commission. We've been so no net loss kind of taking a step back. When we think about wetlands policy, things really start in 1977 with President Carter recognizing that, hey, wetlands are important, and at the federal level, we need to make sure that we consider impacts to wetlands. Fast forward to a conference on wetlands in 1988 that created this report in 1989. It created a twofold goal of no net loss of existing wetlands, and then there is a second goal of having a net gain of wetlands. And the Fish and Wildlife Service puts out a wetlands report. Occasionally, sometimes it happens in a cycle, sometimes it doesn't. The most recent one showed that the last time we had any sort of gain of my wetlands was like really briefly in 2012 and like 2011. But since then, we've been seeing a decrease specifically in tidal wetlands and a small increase of freshwater pond wetlands. And I will let scientists discuss if those are equivalent. Can you say the loss of saltwater wetlands and the increase of freshwater wetlands? It seems like they're two different biomes, two different sort of functions, and both of them are important. This is a good start for HB 521, but also thinking about sea level rise and what are we doing when, for no net loss right now is great, but if sea level rise then naturally increases wetlands, what are we going to do? Which is why we have all these wetlands policy groups happening at the same time. With that, also a big question was we've got these really great innovative shoreline equipment, techniques, interpret it as you will. They're coming out so quickly. It ended up creating this desire to have a habitat policy oversight committee within the Virginia Marine Resource Commission to figure out how do we want to move forward with these innovative projects that may do one thing for one part of an ecosystem, but may change another part. Having someone in a state agency making these decisions as opposed to keeping them in purgatory of like, will a permit happen, seemed like the intuitive step forward. And so this did pass, and looking for guidance of how VMRC wants to move forward with these cool things in the future and how they flood the intersection of flood resiliency and ecosystem health. Okay, now to things that didn't make it. So these didn't make it, but they didn't make it because they were added into the budget language, which we don't have a budget yet, so caveat on that. But there are these really massive billion-dollar coastal storm risk management projects that the Army Corps is putting out in Virginia. The seawall in Norfolk is a prime example. There's one in Hampton. There's going to be one in Virginia Beach. In order to do things, the Army Corps requires that a locality have simple fee interest in that property. But if you're doing things in the water, technically the bottomlands or the land underneath the water is owned by the state, not by the locality. And so this was a temporary fix to figure out how they could say that Norfolk has ownership to do a project. Initially, it was really, really broad, but then it got narrowed down specifically to the parcels and the GPIN maps, the parcel plots, essentially. But then it did not go through, but it was going to be added into hopefully the budget language that will occur in April 23rd, but I'll talk about that at the end. The Joint Subcommittee of Recurrent Flooding was passed. This is the how the General Assembly thinks about flooding. It's a combination of both House and Senate members, and having them be thinking about flood issues and not just necessarily always be on localities who do have land use authority, but recognizing that funding is necessary. Happy to see that that was passed through. Our climate adaptation plan for fisheries did not. This was actually one of the first things to go down this session, and that had to do with the financial impact. It was going to cost money, and there was a pretty clear statement that we wanted to be keep it trim, keep it lean, keep it thin. The Virginia Great Outdoors Act is going to play a bigger question into the budget. It didn't make it through, and it kind of went down in an interesting way. At least the Senate SB 393 went down kind of interestingly, where it sort of died in a vote, and then it was brought back, and then it died in appropriations. But essentially, they were trying to, if you're unfamiliar, Virginia has a lot of data centers due to a how do I a good not a good how do we do value? There is not any state tax on data centers in Virginia due to an exemption, and that exemption was to expire, which is why the budget bill hasn't been decided yet. There is a big question between the House and the Senate of how to move forward with this exemption to data centers, which are eating up a whole bunch of energy, there are water concerns, there are a whole bunch of concerns across the board, and there are also economic development concerns. And in a affordability agenda, how do you balance those things is the big question of this session. And I don't have the answers, but what this bill was going to do was take that exemption away, start taxing data centers, and then that money was going to help fund conservation efforts all around Virginia. And I saw it was potentially up to 1.3 billion. So there would be a significant impact on state revenue to do projects like these. There were other bills in the General Assembly. I believe that there was one for teachers. There are a lot of different people looking at that exemption to help solve some of the needs we have, with the federal cuts and all of this uncertainty. The states are going to have to cover a lot more of health programs, maternal health, Medicaid. All of those are going to be more on the state side. And with that shrinking those sort of budget, where do we get money for others? This was proposed as a solution. But then no one knew how to move forward. And that is also why we're going to have a special session in April 23rd to figure out what will we do. In terms of environmental justice, this bill was actually from 2025 and got voted vetoed in the Youngkin administration. This one passed of just thinking about environmental justice strategies in the next comprehensive plan for cities above 20,000 and counties above 100,000. And since we care about it, yes, you can do land use planning where you look, this is commercial, this is residential, this is industrial, but putting people first in planning is going to create a more resilient community in the future when we're thinking about climate change and energy needs and everything else that's coming along as we move through the 21st century. HJ 20, sort of another forward-looking bill, didn't make it through, but thinking through managed retreat and how we want to do that for legacy property owners facing sea level rise in specific localities. I think it was under 35,000 people population. It was a JLARC study. JLARC has a backlog right now, so it was continued to 2027. Something that we need to be thinking about. Glad to see it. The Commonwealth is going to need to figure out what we want to do with increased exposure and flood hazard through sea level rise in the future. And it's going to happen sooner than later. So if we can start planning now, that makes the best sense, both financially as well as helping people live. Disaster, I'm moving into categories of bills. Disaster response had a little bit of a moment. There was the Virginia Disaster Assistance Fund, VDAF, had amendments, but the Virginia Disaster Assistance Fund is not actually in code, so that bill died, and that language was then put onto the section of the budget bill where the Virginia Disaster Assistance Fund lives. There was an idea of creating the Virginia Resiliency Grant Program, but it was going to be an additional cost, and so that was quickly gently laid on the table, which is the General Assembly's way of killing a bill kindly. Things that made it through, there was an emergency management capabilities work group that initially was really, really big, but then just got cut down to a work group to study what capabilities do we need to think about with emergency management, which sort of falls in line with the most, I think it was Executive Order 12, which is now creating like regional hubs for emergency management that came out of the Spanberger administration. And then another thing was a state of preparedness when you're thinking of emergency management in order to activate those funds, either it be federal or state, there needs to be a state of emergency. But if you're declaring in a state of emergency every time you think something is going to happen, for example, if we think back into February, there are a lot of like, there's going to be a really big snowstorm, everyone be prepared, and then it didn't really manifest. This new state of preparedness will allow funds to be activated, for example, for snowplows without having that sort of semantic word of emergency and then having something not actually happen. And then the public trust is like, well, you said it was an emergency, but nothing really happened. So next time you're going to say there's a state of emergency, I'm kind of gloss over what that means. The state of preparedness kind of resolves that issue. Tribal affairs, a lot of them didn't make it, but the tribal commission was, I misspelled that. The tribal commission was continued. One of the ones that I was hoping would make it were tribal conservation easements. Conservation easements on tribal lands are required in order to do some federal and state funds, like making sure that you have that conservation easement in proper ownership. And without the clear guidance through legislature, those projects may be still in limbo. Disclosure form, happy to report that two of the disclosures did make it through. So there is going to be this buyer beware work group, House Bill 1518 from Delegate Converse Fowler, who has been on top of the disclosure game since she's been here with the big repetitive loss disclosure happening in 2021. We don't have flood risk disclosure in Virginia, but this may be an avenue to consider flood risk disclosure if there is public comment availability in this work group that includes the Bar Association, Housing Realtors Association, etc. PFAS was a big, the ones that did make it are here, but the couple didn't make it. PFAS is going to continue to be an issue, which is what I just want to highlight. And there's small incremental changes that happen here. It's just allowing governments to test sewage sludge, a self-report for industrial users for PFAS, and then can't use sewage sludge with high PFAS values for land application. Data centers was also the big question. The two things that made it through is that you can have a sound profile for a site assessment on data centers. Data centers are really interesting in the sense that you go out with a microphone and you're like, how noisy is this? If you go by a street, it's going to have a whole bunch of decibels. But when you go to a data center, it's a different sort of noise where humans can hear it, but it's not registering on the microphone. It's actually a frequency issue. It's a low frequency that our ears can hear, but isn't necessarily captured. So this site assessment, as well as some work that's been done, I want to say in Prince William County, will help localities figure out how they want to figure out where they want to put data centers because of that noise that can be very irritating for people who live near towards it. And then there's a permit requirement for engine generated data centers. If data centers go off, this engine, a diesel engine goes up. Now DEQ is sort of tracking that with HB 507. We're in Reggie. As far as I'm aware, it should be moving from DEQ, like the proposal to the governor, and we will be it's in the caboose bill, so we're already in it because the caboose bill funds the state government until July 1st. But HB 397 and SB 802, solidified that. And we should be participating in the fall auction August, September. That will then help start regenerating the Community Flood Preparedness Fund and the High Housing Innovations and Energy Efficiency HIEE Fund for DHCD. So happy to report that it looks like we're going to have a connected funding stream for CFPF as opposed to having one-time general appropriations, which we've been doing in the past 2 years. Budget tracking, we will find out. The word on the street from all the podcasts that I'm listening to is that it's not going to be decided on April 23rd. Things didn't look good last or Tuesday. Wow, where does the time go? And so I know I'm not going to hold my breath that they will resolve something, but I will keep people posted on how this special session goes. Essentially, and if you're not following, the Senate wants to discontinue that exemption and use the data center tax to help pay for state programs. House wants to continue and keep economic development with data centers in Virginia. It was really interesting to see different lobbying associations come out in support of different bills, particularly the Virginia Great Outdoors Act. There were like the electricians union was like, hey, no, actually, we want to keep the exemption so that we maintain job opportunities. And how do you balance that? That's going to be the big question for the General Assembly. Also, executive orders. So this is moving from the legislature to just the executive branch, but things to pay attention to. There were 10 executive orders that were signed. The two big ones for the environmental community is EO1, which is affordability directive, as well as EO3, the housing development regulation review, figuring out what are the unnecessary requirements, streamlining approvals, and reducing barriers to housing production. I'm not necessarily worried because uh, if you like the cost of putting a house in a floodplain is really high, and so this floodplain management would fall within both affordability as well as housing development regulation. We do not want people living in unsafe places, so I'm not too worried about that. But I could see wanting to craft, if you are thinking about legislation in the future, how will this be fitting within EO1 or EO3? The other big thing that just happened is Executive Order 14, and that created a Chief Energy Officer, and that is the other thing that I think. One other thing is the Executive Order 12, which creates these regional emergency preparedness summits that are happening. The first one happened, I think, either yesterday or today in Southwest Virginia, and they will be popping around. This is through the Secretariat of Homeland Security. But yes, yeah. So if you're thinking about that, portability is the name of the game for this administration. So start thinking about, we see language changes and we have to adapt to those. And that is the one that is dominating today. Next steps. So veto happened. We have reconvened, aka the veto session, whether or not they're going to accept those 8 vetoes or if they can override them or let them go or accept the amendments or veto the amendments. Then the special section for the budget bill happens on April 23rd. If there are overrides to vetoes and amendments, the deadline for that is May 25th, and then everything, unless there's an enactment clause, is effective on July 1st. So we did it. Do you have any questions? I see that there are 35 pings in the chat. Let me know what I can answer.
The chat has been mostly Kevin weighing in on helpful kind of anecdotes that describe what's going on in a more detailed way. So it's been great, really helpful. Thanks, Kevin.
Awesome.
Questions that you all have for Ian? And there are a lot of experts on this call. a lot of practitioners doing this work every day. And so when we can't answer a question, someone will probably be able to. Mm,
Perfect.
good. Good problem to have. Oh, would like to see. What would you like to see happen? Ooh, Prue, with the $1 million question.
I think, I mean, me personally, it I would like everyone pay their fair share. And if we're seeing a huge energy suck in our like individual property owners' energy bills going up because of new energy usage due to a specific type of industry, it would make sense that they also need to pay for their usage of that as opposed to what's happening and what has happened since that exemption was granted. And then with that new revenue, we've got a lot of new options to help resolve the issues of the funding cuts that the federal government has been giving us. So that's what I feel.
Yeah, and I think that organizationally, um, the data centers issue is a really complicated one. We are waiting to, well, I think that first of all, any proposals to put data centers in areas where wetlands are nearby or have the potential to migrate under sea level rise conditions naturally. So the slope is favorable for an easy transgression. And I'm saying easy, which is it's super simplified, but essentially a more likely path to landward migration, then that proposes or presents a problem for Wetlands Watch's mission. We want to ensure that there are places for our wetlands to migrate so that they do not drown under sea level rise conditions. So that would be kind of one concern. The sooner our state can map wetlands migration areas and include actual restrictions around the use of these migration corridors or migration zones, then that will make standing up and opposing a data center all the easier for groups like Wetlands Watch and many of the partners that are on this call who feel similarly. That's one issue. Obviously, siting data centers where wetlands exist today is a no-go for us, right, as an organization. So that's sort of foundational what we know now. As far as data centers, water usage and the impact to the subsidence challenges that face our the coastal part of our state, that's something that we're waiting for a lot of those studies to come out so that we can really understand the water draw, because the greatest water usage contributor to subsidence in coastal Virginia are our paper plants. So in Franklin and in West Point. And it's pretty clear that those water usage activities are are accelerating subsidence challenges. So that's another element of it that Wetlands Watch is monitoring and watching carefully. Okay, Kevin's weighed in about the regs for no net loss by noting appropriately that we also really need a no-mow policy that's called out more more specifically. For those who might not know this, people are mowing wetlands as they encroach in their backyard all the time, and it's a very difficult thing for a local government who would be the responsible body to enforce to actually do the enforcements at scale. Great point. And
Yes,
Dylan, nice. Go ahead, Ian.
I would thank you for bringing that up. I was tracking that, but I did not put it in the presentation.
Yep, great point. So Dylan's comment, if people don't have access to the chat, is that there was a bill that now is requiring data centers to disclose their water usage, which will help inform a lot of people's uh, understanding of the impacts, especially in the coastal zones.
Cool. Well, we can stay on. We're gonna stop recording.
Yes.
We're free to go.
Thank you, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. See ya.